Welcome to today's Future Supply Actions Funding Program webinar on the development of an approach for the evaluation of brine diffuser shear mortality. I am Don Bentley. I'm an engineer in Metropolitan's Water Resource Management Group and part of the team managing the FSA program. I am your moderator for today's recording. This webinar is pre-recorded. The recording and the slides will be posted on our website. Next slide. Our agenda for today includes a welcome and introductions along with a brief overview of Metropolitan and the Future Supply Actions Funding Program. The presentation for today's webinar and a question and answer period. Next slide. Now I will provide a brief overview of Metropolitan and the FSA funding program. Metropolitan is the primary wholesale water provider in Southern California. We deliver water to 26 member agencies serving 19 million people and support a $1 trillion economy with supplies we import from the Colorado River and from the State Water Project. Next slide. Over the past 30 years, we've diversified our resource portfolio through investments in storage, transfers, conservation, and local supplies. Innovation in local supplies is fundamental to our success as a region as we continue to advance a one water approach. We need to build climate change resiliency into our portfolio, and this is where our FSA program fits. Next slide. Metropolitan initiated the FSA program in our 2010 Integrated Resource Plan with the goal of driving innovation in local supply development. Through the program, Metropolitan collaborates with our member agencies to pilot new approaches and de-risk new technologies, create opportunities for new supply development by addressing and removing barriers, and these barriers include technological barriers, regulatory barriers, and institutional barriers. And finally, it's to benefit the region as a core principle of our program. Next slide. The current program includes 14 studies with our member agency partners covering all 4 resources. And we have also co-funded 7 reuse studies with the Water Research Foundation. These studies might not help us through this current drought, but they will help in the next drought and build resiliency to climate change. Next slide. Our member agency partner for this study is the West Basin Municipal Water District. Our speakers include today Alejandra Cano of West Basin Municipal Water District, Dr. Al Preston of Geosyntec Consultants, and Minnie Berg of Environmental Science Associates. At this point, I will turn it over to Alejandra.
You are muted, Alejandra.
Thank you, Minnie. Thank you, Don. We're certainly happy to be here presenting the results of this study that is part of the ocean desalination exploration that aim to evaluate one of the key components of ocean desalination for ocean desalination applicants, which is the mortality percentage that will need to be mitigated. In this particular study, the focus is to develop and facilitate an approach that evaluates the shear mortality or the turbulence-induced mortality that is caused at the discharge of the brine diffuser. So we certainly have a lot to cover today. Here we have the components that will be presented. For those who don't know who West Basin is, I will provide a quick overview. It was important for us to acknowledge the entire project team. So we'll go over that and we'll discuss the background, the study goals, and overview of the study. we'll go then to the two major components of the study, which are the computational fluid dynamics of the model and the mortality literature review. We face some challenges, so we're gonna go over those challenges that we have for each of these two components and how we got what were the takes that we got from these two components, and we integrated into two cases that we studied during this research project. Finally, but not least, we're gonna go over some of the key lessons learned and some of the recommendations that the project team have for future research and projects. So for those who don't know who West Basin is, West Basin is a public wholesale water agency that provides imported drinking water to nearly 1 million people in Southern California, about like 17 cities. It also produces recycled water for the region. And it's, in fact, one of the member agencies of Metropolitan Water District. And for over 20 years, West Basin explored ocean desalination as a portable drinking water supply source. This effort in particular is part of that exploration. So we are happy to be able to conduct this study and to present the results today. Just a little bit more of West Basin. West Basin is governed by an elected 5 members of the board. Out of these 5 members, 2 members are appointed to represent West Basin at the Metropolitan Board of Directors. We currently have Director Gloria Gray and Director Harold Williams as part of this Board of Directors in Metropolitan. Each of the directors represents a division of the service area that covers, as I mentioned, a large portion of the South Bay and LA area, as you could see here in the map. If you visit the West Basin website, you can type in your address and see whether or not you are in our area and service area and who your water retailer is. So I'll move here to the project team. This research in particular was sponsored by 2 agencies. Metropolitan Water District is one of them under the Future Supply Action, and the Bureau of Reclamation under the Desalination Water Purification Research and Development Program. In addition to that, we have great collaboration from different agencies and different parties. And the project team in particular, it was constituted with multiple expertise in their own areas of expertise. So we have Dr. Al Preston from Geosyntec. He is the co-principal investigator and team lead of the project, as well as the fluid mechanics expert. We also have Mina Burr, Dr. Mina Burr. She is our marine bioscience expert. Dr. Al Preston and Dr. Mina Burr, as Don mentioned, they are going to be here presenting the study, the results of the studies. In addition, we have Eric Sigas as part of the team. He was great collaboration and the Californian Ocean Plan lead expert, and Alex Wesner as the treatment and water quality lead. And in addition to the project team, we had a project advisor committee that was formed in order to kind of like revise and provide advisory to the project team. So we have great collaboration for that with Dr. Phil Roberts from the Georgian Institute of Technology and Dr. Brian Gaylor from the UC Davis. So we had this great team, great collaboration. And I also want to acknowledge the participation of the State Water Resource Control Board, 2 representatives, Daniel Ellis and Leslie Hart, who provided a great input and collaboration, and we're gonna acknowledge that and thank him for that. So with that, I will hand it over to Al Preston, who will be presenting the background of the study.
Great, thank you very much, Alejandra and Don. So the next few slides, I'm going to explain a little bit about what we're actually looking at. What is the problem that we're trying to do more research into. So Alejandro, if you can advance the next slide. You know, what is this brine diffuser shear mortality that we talk about? So there's a couple of schematics here. So for a desalination plant, it interacts with the ocean kind of at two primary points. One is on the intake side, the little schematic to the left. That is where the ocean water is drawn into the desalination plant. Water that is drawn into the desalination plant goes through a treatment process, and it's pretty clear that any organisms that are entrained through that process will have 100% mortality. They're not going to make it through that treatment process. I will point out that for an open intake, using a wedge wire screen, with a 1 millimeter gap, and limiting the through flow velocities to less than half a foot per second can substantially decrease the number and types of organisms that are actually entrained into the intake, but those that do get through into the intake will have 100% mortality. So the desalination plant takes in the ocean water. It produces approximately 50% fresh water, which it's delivered to customers, and about a 50% brine waste stream, which is then typically discharged back into the ocean. So the brine waste stream has approximately twice the salinity of the ocean because it's basically concentrated seawater. It is therefore more dense and it tends to sink. And it's required to, per the ocean plan, to protect the environment, it is required to make sure that this discharge adequately mixes with the ambient ocean. If you don't mix it, then you may get pools of highly saline water accumulating on the ocean floor, for example. So typically the mixing is achieved through a diffuser system, such as the one shown here on the schematic on the right. The diffuser system, it jets or discharges the water through ports. It's usually orientated upwards because the extra density of the discharge is generally going to cause the plume to sink. So you want to shoot it away from the ocean floor, typically at a 60-degree angle, which is the most efficient in terms of meeting mixing requirements. And to meet the mixing requirements typically requires a higher velocity. If you have a higher velocity, you get more mixing, you get more dilution. As a jet is discharged, it then is mixing with the ambient ocean water. It's entraining the ambient ocean water, and that is actually the dilution process. So the ambient ocean water also has organisms in it, and typically here we're talking about small organisms that are non-motile, and these are entrained into the jets. And the jets themselves have it's a region of high shear flow and high intensity turbulence. We've got high velocity water coming out of the jets next to low velocity water of the ocean, and this can create eddies and cause turbulence. And it's been acknowledged that sometimes these high intensity turbulence can cause damage to organisms or even mortality. And this, the amount of mortality of these entrained organisms is not well understood. If we can go to the next slide. So the image on the left is actually a video from the lab of Dr. Phil Roberts, and it's a kind of a slice down the discharge plume, and it's very useful to kind of understand what these discharge jet and plumes look like. And based on this and some other work, a current approach to estimate the mortality due to this shear, high turbulence and shear was developed. If you look at the image, you can see when it's discharged from the jet, it's got very high velocity. It's mixing with the ambient ocean water. We get these quite small turbulent structures, and the turbulence intensity there is very high. By contrast, once the jet has reached the top, it's really a jet plume. The jet refers to the momentum of the exit, and the plume refers to the fact that the negative buoyancy or the more dense discharge is now sinking. Once the jet plume reaches the apex and starts the descending phase, we can see that the turbulent structures the flow is a lot more gentle. The turbulence is a lot less damaging. So based on this, the current approach that is recommended to estimate the shear mortality is to estimate the entrainment of organisms to the apex of the plume. And you can do this through a number of ways, through empirical estimates or through other fairly simple modeling approaches, and then assume that the turbulence all the way up that ascending portion is intense enough to cause 100% mortality of those organisms that are entrained in. So we wanted to reevaluate this, I guess, from two main perspectives. The first is looking at this video. You can kind of see the turbulence is getting less intense as you get nearer and nearer to the apex, and it is kind of hypothesized that the negative buoyancy of the plume is actually attenuating the turbulence. So maybe we may not need to, assume that all the organisms entrained up to the apex are subject to damaging turbulence. Maybe only 2/3 of the way up, for example. So we really wanted to better understand the turbulence intensity throughout the jet and the plume. And the second piece is assuming that everything that is subject to this turbulence dies, like 100% mortality. We wanted to take a closer look at that and use better science to see if that is a reasonable assumption. If we go to the next slide. So with that in mind, just to summarize the study goals, we really wanted to improve the understanding and the characterization of the shear and the turbulence within the brine discharge jet and plume, and then specifically relate the turbulent intensity to mortality rates of different organisms. And then, so basically improving the science to provide a methodology to enable more realistic estimates of the shear mortality than the current approach. And ultimately, by studying this, these things, we may be able to inform improved designs of diffuser systems to minimize mortality while still meeting the ocean plan dilution requirements. So we can't just eject, have the jets go at a lower velocity, because that won't meet the ocean plan requirements. So with these study goals in mind, we developed an approach. If we go to the next slide. So we developed an approach where we looked at mortality studies through a literature review in parallel with setting up some CFD simulations. So the mortality studies aim to quantify mortality rates to different turbulence intensities. In parallel, we set up some CFD simulations to really understand the different turbulence intensities throughout the jet and the plume. In order to set up the CFD simulations, we needed to first characterize the reverse osmosis brine concentrations, and that's where Alex Wesner helped us out. We took the CFD simulations and the mortality studies to develop a new approach, and then we also, just to illustrate how the approach may be applied it to a couple of case studies. So I'm going to dive into some of the details of the CFD simulations, and then Monet is going to take over and talk about the mortality studies and the approach, and the application of the approach. Next slide, please. So we spent a lot of time developing a computational fluid dynamics model. And if you go to the next slide, Alejandro. And the reason for this was we really wanted to understand the effects of the negative buoyancy, the fact that the plume is sinking, how that may impact turbulence. So here we have two videos. The one on the right you've already seen. It is of a typical dense discharge in a laboratory. The one on the left is of a neutrally buoyant jet. So what do I mean by that? It just means that the density of the jet is the same as the density of the ambient fluid. So the one on the left more or less travels in a straight line, obviously with the entrainment of the ambient fluid and the dilution associated with that, compared to the one on the right, which initially travels in a straight line, but then the negative buoyancy starts to dominate and cause the plume to sink. So the jet on the left has been studied for decades in fluid mechanics in labs, and the turbulence characteristics in that are quite well understood. We're going to use what we call the Kolmogorov scale as a measure of turbulence intensity. The Kolmogorov scale is the smallest length scale in the flow. So the smaller the length scale kind of means that, the smaller the eddies are, the actual more intense the turbulence is, and the more potential for damage to organisms. So Phil Roberts developed this equation, the equation on the bottom left, to estimate the length scale for the Kolmogorov scale on the center line of a neutrally buoyant jet. So eta sub c is the Kolmogorov scale. I'm not going to go into details, but basically that equation predicts that you start with very small Kolmogorov scales at the port, and as you get further away, they become larger. And again, larger means less damaging. So Phil then took this equation and applied it to the situation on the right. And you can see very near to the jet, this equation is probably quite valid. The momentum is dominating. But as you get closer to the apex, the negative buoyancy is starting to have an effect on the flow. And by looking at the videos, it appears that the negative buoyancy is attenuating the turbulence properties. So the goal of the CFD was to basically simulate the situation on the right and then extract information from the CFD model that characterizes the turbulent intensity. Next slide, please. So we set up many different CFD simulations. We've got 11 in the table here. The first one, run number 0, is a validation run. I'm not going to go through all the parameters, but the important column is the port diameter. So the validation run was set up to compare to experiments in the lab, so we had some confidence that the CFD model was replicating the physics correctly. It had a port diameter of 0.004 meters, so 4 millimeters, so very small. So that's not a realistic size for an ocean scale discharge. So the next 4 runs we used more realistic sizes of port diameters, ranging from 0.05 meters to 0.4 meters. So that's about 2 inches to about 16 inches. So, you know, reasonable sizes for ocean scale discharges. The next several runs, I'm not going to talk too much. We did look at different blends of fresh water, brine discharge mixed with fresh water, or if we had a different source water, how that may look. We're not going to talk too much about those, but the last one was a neutrally buoyant simulation where we had the density of the discharge the same as that of the ambient fluid. And we did that just as, I guess, for 2 reasons. One is to validate the model again, the modeling approach, but also to act as a comparison. Just focusing on the simulations 1 through 4, the results of those are plotted on the frames on the right. It's a color contour plot showing the simulated velocity. So red means higher velocity, blue means low or 0 velocity, and it's on a slice through the jet, or through the jet plume. So there's a horizontal axis and a vertical axis kind of representing distances from the port in a horizontal direction and a vertical direction. Now you look at these and all 4 simulations look very similar, and the reason for that is we normalized both the velocities and the axes in these plots. So we divided the velocity by the initial port velocity. That's why all the colors look similar, even though the actual velocities do differ, as shown in the table. And we divided the x-axis and the z-axis by the port diameter times the fluid number. So when we scale it with the port diameter, the equations of fluid mechanics indicate that everything should kind of collapse down to similar results. And so this in itself is some validation that the CFD is behaving as we'd expect. So although these plots all look the same, the actual turbulence intensity in these runs are a little different. If we go to the next plot. So when we run the CFD, we get a lot of information. We get a very detailed view of, 3-dimensional view of almost anything you can think of within the plume. So here we've plotted trajectories of organisms that are entrained into the jet plume. The black cylinder is the port nozzle, and the path lines are path lines from the simulation. The left frame is run 1 with a port diameter of 0.05 meters or a couple of inches, and the right frame is run 4 with a port diameter that is 8 times bigger. Things kind of look similar, but we've color coded these trajectories by the simulated Kolmogorov scale. So brown is a large scale, which means less damaging turbulence, less intense turbulence. And you can see far away from the port that there's a lot of brown colors, and that makes sense. By contrast, green is a small Kolmogorov scale, and is higher intensity turbulence and more damaging. And you can see that the simulation on the right has more green than the simulation on the left, and that is again because it has a higher port diameter, has a higher Reynolds number, which is critical to, is a key measure of turbulence intensity. But a key takeaway on this is that throughout the rising portion of both simulations, we're kind of in the green colors, and the Kolmogorov scale is less than a millimeter. In fact, when we took a close look, it's less than about half a millimeter in the rising portion of the plume in both cases, and that's going to become important when Mene talks us through some of the literature studies on mortality shortly. If we can go to the next slide. So we further dug into the CFD results, and we extracted the Kolmogorov scale along the center line for each of the simulations, and we plotted that on the plot here. So the vertical axis is the Kolmogorov scale in millimeters. The horizontal axis is distance along the center line. It again has been normalized by the port diameter, and we've got several lines on this plot. So the first one I'll point you to is the dashed line, which starts at 0 and it goes linearly increases with distance from the port diameter, and that's the relation developed by Phil Roberts based on a neutrally buoyant jet. The blue solid line is the CFD simulation from the neutrally buoyant jet, so with no density effects. And we can see that close to the port, so for values of S over D, less than 2 or 3, we have quite high Kolmogorov scales, actually less intense in the simulations, and that's due to the potential core region of the jet. But as we get a little bit further away, that core starts to mix with the ambient fluid, and we generate higher intensities, around 5 port diameters away from the nozzle. And then as we get further and further away out into kind of the near field, we get increasing Kolmogorov scales. The important thing to note here is that the relation derived by Roberts is really an order of magnitude approach. It doesn't apply very close to the port nozzle. That's why it differs from the simulations. And the fact that it's a different slope than indicated by the simulations is not to be unexpected, because it was an order of magnitude approach. But the important thing to note is that our CFD tends to kind of actually agree with the approach from developed by Dr. Roberts. The other 4 lines are, I guess, the important ones. That's the whole point of this exercise, and they are the Kolmogorov scale along the center line for the 4 simulations that are negatively buoyant, jet, and plume for the different port diameters, and they all kind of collapse to a similar range of values. The important thing to note is that we are indicating larger Kolmogorov scales as we get a little bit further away from the port. And this is because this is the effect of the negative buoyancy. So our hypothesis was that the negative buoyancy is going to attenuate the turbulence intensity. And again, that means larger Kolmogorov scales. And we actually see that this is the case. So our hypothesis was correct. However, the differences are relatively small. And you'll note that these Kolmogorov scales are all well less than ½ millimeter. And that's going to be important again as we look at the mortality studies. So if we go to the next slide, I think my final slide, I'll just kind of summarize the key findings from the CFD. We did find that the negative buoyancy does reduce the turbulence intensity along the rising portion of the jet compared to a neutrally buoyant jet. So that was good. However, for typical diffuser designs, like for diffuser with realistically sized ports for ocean implementation, the Kolmogorov scale remains below ½ millimeter throughout the rising portion of the plume. So the turbulence is still intense. Even though it's less, it is still intense. The results are generally consistent with the approach of Roberts in terms of predicting a linear increase in the Kolmogorov scale in the rising portion of the plume. So we really focused those CFD results on the turbulence intensity, but they can also be used for a wealth of other, they also contain a wealth of other information. We can extract statistics, of turbulence, intensities and durations, time histories, trajectories, entrainment velocities, entrainment volumes, and there's a lot of information there. And one thing that we did look at, and I want to point out, is the duration that an organism that is entrained into the plume may be exposed to these high intensity turbulence. And based on the CFD results, those durations are on the order of tens of seconds. And that's important to keep in mind as we look at as Miné presents the experiments, because typically the experiments had much longer durations, and that's something we needed to account for. So with that, I will hand it over to Miné to go through the literature studies.
Thanks, Al. So with this literature review, what would be the mortality of small organisms entrained into the plume of a jet discharge? Would it be 100% as for the intake, or would it be different? So to attempt to answer this question, we initially examined more than 30 papers, which we then narrowed down to 11 studies that met our criteria of quantifying organism mortality as a function of turbulence expressed as energy dissipation rates or similar. Next slide, please. A key finding from this review was that the mortality of organisms from exposure to turbulence was greatest when the size of the organism was comparable to the size of the smallest eddies, the Kolmogorov length scale eddies. So this concept is illustrated in this figure here. Looking at panel A, when the organisms are small relative to the Kolmogorov eddy size, then shear stresses tend to be small, and the main role of the turbulence is to cause movement of the organism with little deformation. Looking at panel B, when the organism has the same size as the eddy, shear stresses and potential deformation are at a maximum. So for example, here's a picture of a bivalve caught between flows moving in opposite directions across its shell, and flows like that could potentially pull the shell apart. Looking at panel C, when the Kolmogorov length scale is smaller than the organism, then the organism is not really impacted. Here's a picture of a juvenile fish, which is simply swimming away. Next slide, please. Another key finding was that turbulence-induced mortality increased above background mortalities when the Kolmogorov length scale was 0.5 millimeters and smaller. So on this graph, on the y-axis is the adjusted mortality, which is the mortality above background mortalities, and the x-axis is the Kolmogorov length scale. And as you can see, the mortality increases sharply below a Kolmogorov length scale of about 0.5 millimeters. Next slide, please. These data suggested that turbulence at small scales had the potential to impact organisms with a diameter of 0.5 millimeter or smaller the most in terms of mortality. Next slide, please. However, at a length scale of 0.5 millimeter and less, it was not a given that an organism or a larvae would have a high mortality. For example, some larvae, such as polychaetes, had no mortality in response to turbulence at any intensity, suggesting that their covering was not very sensitive to shear stresses and cross-body flows. In contrast, larvae of freshwater bivalves were very sensitive, with one study demonstrating a maximum mortality of 70% of the population. Unfortunately, none of the studies in our review included commercially important larval species such as fish. Next slide, please. As mentioned above, the maximum observed mortality was 70%, and this mortality was achieved in a study where freshwater bivalves were continuously exposed to high energy dissipation rates for a period of 24 hours. And this is quite a bit longer than the exposure duration expected when entrained into a brine discharge plume, which Al mentioned earlier would probably vary around tens of seconds. In experiments where organisms were exposed for less than 5 minutes, mortalities were below 50%, and the median mortality for this data set was 20%. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the lessons that we learned from the literature review was that mortality of small marine organisms from turbulence increased sharply when their size was comparable to that of the smallest turbulent eddies, and that mortality of larval organisms was most likely limited to the region of the jet where the Kolmogorov length scale was less than 0.5 millimeters. We also learned that maximum mortalities differed by taxonomic groups, and that the short-term mortality, so 5 minutes or less, was less than 50%. Next slide, please. In terms of applying these lessons from the literature review to the estimation of environmental impacts from brine discharge into the ocean, there were two principal data gaps. One data gap was that the studies we reviewed mainly covered freshwater larvae, and as such were not representative of oceanic species. In addition, the studies did not provide mortality data for larvae of commercially important species such as fish or larvae of sensitive marine species, which are typically used for determining ecological impacts. For example, the area production foregone, or APF calculation, quantifies loss of fish or shellfish larvae to estimate impacts to fishable populations. Another data gap was that none of the mechanisms of generating turbulence in these studies included a jet stream, which is how the brine will be discharged into the ocean. An interesting observation that we made was that the mortality of the organisms varied depending on the mechanisms used to generate the turbulence. In other words, the same turbulence intensity and Kolmogorov length scale produced substantially varying mortalities depending on the mechanisms used to generate the turbulence. And this is counterintuitive because at the Kolmogorov scale, turbulence properties do not depend on how the turbulence is generated, and therefore should give the same result in terms of mortalities. The fact that this was not the case calls into question whether a portion of the mortalities we observed in these studies was actually due to physical damage from the implements used to generate the turbulence. If so, this illustrates the importance of using a jet stream to generate the turbulence in order to extrapolate results to what will happen with discharge of brine in the ocean. Impacts to populations are typically estimated by calculating the mortality of a specific larval population and then extrapolating that mortality across the area which the population is distributed. Using this estimation, called the area production foregone, or APF, for the discharge requires input of susceptibility of individual fish larvae to turbulence. Next slide, please. Next, I will go through estimating impacts to populations from turbulence using the APF calculation for two different case studies. Next slide, please. So Al presented this slide earlier, and this diagram illustrates the difference between calculating proportional mortalities associated with the seawater intake versus the brine discharge. For the intake, all organisms smaller than the screen on the intake are assumed to be entrained, and all of the entrained organisms are assumed to perish. The number of organisms that perishes is calculated from measurements of their concentration in the water column close to the intake. And for the discharge APF examples that we'll present here, we will use a size exclusion of 1 millimeter combined with a mortality of 50%. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into the specific details of the APF calculation, but if you're interested in that, I recommend you read Appendix E of the Ocean Plan Desalination Amendment. This slide is just a quick review of how APF is calculated. It's the proportional mortality of a target larval population estimated using the empirical transport model times the seawater area over which the larval population is distributed. If we assume that the concentration of organisms in the waters surrounding the discharge is the same as in the water surrounding the intake, and we already have calculated proportional mortalities for the intake, then we can apply an appropriate scaling factor for the entrainment volume into the discharge plume, and also a scaling factor for the size of the organisms, and finally a scaling factor for mortality to produce proportional mortalities for individual larval species for the discharge. Next slide, please. So here's a slide illustrating what that calculation would look like for the West Basin Desalination Project discharge. In column 1 are the different types of target fish species larvae found in the vicinity of the seawater intake. And in column 3, labeled PM-in, is the intake proportional mortality expressed as a proportion of the total larval population in the area. And column 4 through 6, labeled FV, FS, and FM, are the different scaling factors. FV for volume, FS for size, FM for mortality. And applying these factors, we get the target larvae proportional mortalities for the discharge in the last column, here called PM-DIS2. Next slide, please. And this next slide illustrates the same calculations for the Huntington Beach desalination plant. And again, the last column, PM-DIS2, contains the proportional mortalities for the discharge. Next slide, please. So by multiplying these proportional mortalities for each larvae and then adding them together and multiplying with the area over which they're distributed, the APF, area production foregone, is calculated. And this slide shows a comparison of the intake APF with the discharge APF in acres. So here you see the first line is for the West Basin Desalination Project. We calculated an intake APF of around 48 acres and a discharge APF of around 2 acres. And then for the Huntington Beach project, we calculated an intake APF of 78 acres and a discharge APF of around 9 acres. And now I will turn the presentation back to Alejandra.
Thank you, Mine. That was great. So we learned very useful things, and we have very useful information with the 2 components of the study, the computational fluid dynamics modeling and the literature review. For the computational fluid dynamics model, the major key lesson is that, in fact, negative buoyance attenuates turbulence intensity but the turbulence on the rising portion of it's still potential damaging. For the mortality literature review, and based on the review and that it was demonstrated that mortality of small larvae organisms increase when the K scale is below 0.5, it makes sense to use 1 millimeter size exclusion threshold, as well as use 15% mortality in the calculation and no 100. So the project team has, as a recommendation for future experimental studies, to use target species to test the vulnerability of larvae to turbulence, as well as creating the turbulence or generating the turbulence using a jet stream because of the changes that we have with these mechanisms. So with that, I will hand it over to Dawn for any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This was a great presentation. The results of this study will benefit water agencies and cities looking to address significant aspects of brine discharge associated with seawater desalination. So we have time for 2 questions. The first question is, how was the computational fluid dynamics validated?
Yeah, thanks, Don. I can take that one. We validated it primarily by comparing it to results from laboratory experiments that have been conducted over the past years and have published papers on it. I think we have a slide which kind of shows, yeah, some of the information we get. So there's a lot to look at on the slide, but I'll go through each of these plots, I guess, just briefly. The first one, kind of the center, the black and white plot with the blue line, is actually a neutrally buoyant jet, and the graph, the black and white piece, is from a pretty old textbook. If you look at some of the dates of that experimental data, it's decades old, and it shows the turbulence intensity as a function of distance from the port, and the blue line is the CFD results. So we can kind of see close to the port, we overestimate the turbulence intensities, and there's some reasons for that. But as we get far away from the port, the CFD model does a good job of matching the experiment, so it's able to capture the attenuation of the turbulence intensity. The other plots on the top right are kind of more graphical comparisons. So the black and white plot is from experiment of Roberts and all. So you can kind of compare that to the plot on the right. They've got similar shapes and sizes. Similarly, the 2 frames below that, the one on the left is from some other experiments by Abisi and Roberts, and the one on the right is from the simulation. And again, that kind of qualitative comparisons. And then finally, this is an important one. We looked at the concentration of the discharge at different slices throughout the plume. So the lower left plot shows CFD results, and we've got 3 slices. One close to the port, kind of cutting through the red area. One cutting at the vertical line, cutting through the apex of the plume, and then a kind of 45-degree line cutting through the downward portion of the plume. And the plots that kind of look like Gaussians or bell curves. The upper row is from the experiments of Abisi and Roberts. So each frame has a Gaussian curve, which is kind of the solution for a neutrally buoyant discharge. But for a negatively buoyant discharge, you actually get this additional mixing on the bottom portion of the curve, and we can see that the measured data deviates from the Gaussian curve, and then the bottom frame is the same plots recreated from the CFD simulations. So we see that we're able to get the different concentration fields in the bottom portion of the plume. So these are kind of comparisons with experiments in the primary way. We also compared it to other CFD models that other researchers have done over the past and found kind of similar performance.
Okay, thank you, Al. We have time for one final question. The question is, can you explain more about the different turbulence generation mechanisms?
Yeah, and I think this is important. So for diffuser, the turbulence is all generated in what's called a free shear flow. We have high velocity water next to low velocity water, and you get these roll up of vortices and a lot of mixing and turbulence. In most of the experiments we found, the turbulence was instead generated through mechanical actuators. Here's some examples here. So the one on the left is a vertically oscillating grid. So there's a grid in the water and it's going up and down, and that's causing turbulence. The next one has a stirrer. So there's a paddle that's rotating, and same with the third one. And paddles may or may not have holes in it, and whether they had holes or not made a difference. And then you've got another example, flow through perforated plates and pipes, so that the actual flow through these little orifices cause the turbulence. So this is kind of, I guess, mechanical generation of turbulence, and it is quite different to a free shear layer, and it's hypothesized that just the action of the organisms potentially hitting these paddles or grids would be causing some of the mortality that was measured in the experiments. So in some ways, the experiments could be an overestimate of the actual mortality that could exist in a free shear layer that would exist in a brine discharge.
I do want to kind of like mention too, and just to kind of like echo what Al said, that mortality of organisms in the studies that were reviewed really vary depending on the mechanisms used to apply this turbulence. So that's one of the important lessons that we got and we shared in this presentation. It's to in any experiment, future experiments, to really look at the jet streams for creating turbulence and know these type of mechanisms, because we saw the difference in the mortality.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That's all the questions we have time for today. You can reach out to today's presenters for additional information. At this time, I want to thank the presenters, Alejandra, Al, and Mine, and the West Basin Municipal Water District, who sponsored the study and shepherded it through this COVID-19 crisis. I also want to recognize the Metropolitan FSA team, Warren Teitz, the FSA Program Manager, Matt Hacker, Ariba Syed, Stephanie Franco, Teresa Gonzalez, Ryan Roman, and Lauren Carrillo. Without their outstanding work, the FSA program in this webinar would not be possible. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.